Trade for taxes. Can tariffs replace income tax? Section 1. The origins of taxation and tariffs. Understanding the evolution of tax systems. Chapter 1. The first taxes in history. How did ancient civilizations fund their governments? Opening question. A world without income tax? What if the government had never introduced income tax? How would societies have evolved without it? To understand whether tariffs could replace income tax, we must first explore how governments throughout history funded themselves. Before income tax became the dominant form of revenue, societies relied on various forms of taxation, trade levies, tributes, and duties on goods passing through borders. These systems shaped economies, power structures, and even the rise and fall of empires. Could an alternative taxation system, based on trade and tariffs, work today? Early taxation. The price of civilization. Taxes have existed for as long as organized societies. The earliest known taxation systems didn't target personal income but rather transactions, land ownership, and trade. Unlike modern tax structures, which often impose a direct burden on individuals, these early systems relied on levies tied to commerce and economic activity. Some of the first recorded taxes include ancient Mesopotamia, circa 3000 BCE. The Sumerians imposed a system called Bala, where citizens paid grain and livestock taxes to support infrastructure, the military, and religious temples. Egypt, circa 2500 BCE. Pharaohs collected taxes in the form of crops and labor, meaning that the workforce itself was a form of national revenue. Workers helped construct pyramids and canals as a tax contribution. China's salt tax, circa 2200 BCE. One of the world's first enduring taxes, the salt tax provided stable government revenue for thousands of years. Even in ancient times, governments understood the power of taxing essential goods. The Roman Empire, 27 BCE to 476 CE. Rome didn't tax individual income but rather trade, goods, and property. One of the most significant sources of revenue came from customs duties on imported goods, a tariff-based approach. In all these societies, revenue was largely extracted from commercial activity rather than direct taxation on personal earnings. The question is, why did this system change? The age of tariffs. When trade paid for government. For much of human history, governments avoided taxing individuals directly. Instead, they found ways to generate revenue from businesses, landowners, and merchants. By the 18th and 19th centuries, tariffs became the primary source of revenue for many nations, particularly in Europe and the United States. Governments realized that by imposing fees on imports and exports, they could collect revenue while also protecting domestic industries. The United States, 1790s-1913. Before the introduction of federal income tax, the U.S. relied almost entirely on tariffs, which accounted for up to 95% of government revenue in some years. The British Empire. Britain funded its colonial administration through trade taxes and customs duties, avoiding direct taxation on most citizens. Imperial China. The government imposed heavy tariffs on foreign goods, particularly during the Opium Wars, as a means of controlling trade and securing state revenue. For centuries, tariffs were the economic backbone of governments. However, a major shift occurred in the early 20th century, one that led to the widespread adoption of income tax. The rise of income tax. A necessary shift or a political convenience? The turning point came with the Industrial Revolution and the growing complexity of economies. As governments expanded their services, military spending, public infrastructure, and social programs, the need for stable, scalable revenue sources increased. War and the need for more revenue. The Napoleonic Wars, 1803 to 1815, forced Britain to introduce a temporary income tax. The American Civil War, 1861 to 1865, saw the U.S. government create an income tax to fund military expenses. World War I, 1914 to 1918, made income tax a permanent fixture in many countries, as trade-based taxes alone were insufficient to sustain wartime economies. The U.S. Income Tax Revolution, 1913. Before 1913, the U.S. federal government relied almost entirely on tariffs and excise taxes. With the ratification of the 16th Amendment, Congress gained the power to impose an income tax, shifting the burden from trade to individuals. The transition from tariff-based taxation to income tax was not just about revenue, it was also a matter of political control and economic centralization. Governments found it easier to collect revenue through payroll deductions than to rely on volatile trade patterns. Could we return to a tariff-based system? What if the US had never introduced income tax? Could tariffs have continued to fund the government? Pros. Tariffs are indirect taxes, meaning individuals aren't directly taxed on their income. A tariff-based system could protect domestic industries. It simplifies the tax code, no need for complicated IRS rules. Cons. Heavy reliance on tariffs might increase consumer prices. International trade agreements, like WTO rules, limit extreme tariff policies. The global economy is more interconnected than in the 18th century, making pure tariff-based revenue models difficult to sustain. However, some argue that a hybrid model, where tariffs replace a significant portion of income tax, could be feasible. If structured correctly, it could reduce individual tax burdens while keeping government revenue stable. Conclusion. What history teaches us about the future of taxation? Looking back at history, we see that for most of civilization, governments funded themselves through commerce, trade, and tariffs, not direct taxation on income. The shift to income tax was largely a product of war, economic expansion, and political convenience. Could we return to a tariff-driven system today? Would consumers accept higher prices in exchange for no income tax? Would businesses adapt, or would global trade wars erupt? The next chapter explores these possibilities, diving into how a tariff-based system would actually work in the modern world. Key takeaways. Checkmark. For most of history, governments relied on trade, tariffs, and land taxes, not income tax. Checkmark. Tariffs once accounted for up to 95% of U.S. government revenue. Checkmark. The rise of income tax was driven by war and economic expansion. Checkmark. A return to a tariff-based system today would require careful balancing of trade policy and consumer pricing. Chapter 2. The birth of tariffs, early trade-based taxation. When did nations start using tariffs as a primary revenue source? Opening question. Could a nation survive on tariffs alone? Imagine a world where your paycheck is entirely yours, no income tax deductions, no IRS paperwork. Instead, the government funds itself entirely through taxes on imports and exports. How would that impact prices, wages, and trade relations? Would it be fairer, or would it cause more problems than it solves? To answer these questions, we must go back to the origins of tariffs and understand how they became one of the earliest and most enduring forms of government revenue. For centuries, nations built their wealth and power through trade taxation rather than taxing their own citizens directly. Some of the greatest civilizations in history, Egypt, Rome, China, the Ottoman Empire, thrived on a tax model based on tariffs and trade duties. But when and why did this model take shape? And what lessons can we learn from it today? The first tariffs in history. A convenient taxation model. Tariffs, in their simplest form, are taxes imposed on goods as they cross national or regional borders. They can serve multiple purposes, generating revenue, protecting domestic industries, and even shaping foreign policy. Some of the earliest records of tariff-like taxation date back to ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt, where governments placed levies on goods brought into their territories. Merchants, travelers, and traders passing through these regions had to pay taxes to local rulers in return for protection, market access, and trade rights. Ancient Egypt, circa 2000 BCE. The pharaohs collected tariffs on imported goods, particularly luxury items such as spices, gold, and textiles from Nubia and the Levant. These taxes helped finance infrastructure projects, including irrigation systems and temples. Ancient China, circa 1000 BCE. The Chinese imposed duties on traders traveling along the Silk Road. The salt tax, one of the most enduring tariffs in history, was a major revenue source for over 1,000 years. The Roman Empire, circa 27 BCE to 476 CE. Rome built one of the most sophisticated trade-based tax systems, imposing customs duties on goods entering its territories. The portorium, a customs duty, applied to all imported and exported goods, ensuring a steady revenue stream for the empire. These early examples show a clear trend. Societies preferred to tax commerce and trade rather than individual labor. But as civilizations grew, so did their need for revenue, leading to the expansion and institutionalization of tariff-based systems. Tariffs as the backbone of medieval and Renaissance economies. During the Middle Ages, tariffs became an essential tool for European kingdoms. As trade routes expanded across continents, governments realized that taxing imported goods was an effective way to fill their treasuries. Medieval Europe, circa 800–1500 CE. Feudal lords charged tolls and trade duties at market towns and river crossings. The Hanseatic League, a powerful trade confederation of merchant cities, imposed tariffs to protect its economic dominance in northern Europe. The Venetian Republic thrived by taxing goods passing through its Mediterranean ports, making Venice one of the wealthiest cities of the time. The Ottoman Empire, circa 1300 to 1800 CE. The Ottomans controlled trade routes between Europe and Asia, levying tariffs on all goods moving through their empire. The empire's tax system, called the Iltism, allowed local governors to collect trade taxes and remit a portion to the central government. Renaissance England, circa 1500 to 1700 CE. England imposed high tariffs on foreign textiles to protect its domestic wool industry. By the late 1600s, customs duties accounted for nearly 50% of the English government's revenue, proving how crucial tariffs had become. These examples highlight a key point. Tariffs were not just about raising revenue, they were economic tools that shaped entire industries and trade relations. By imposing or adjusting tariffs, governments could manipulate markets, encourage domestic production, and even control diplomatic relations. The Golden Age of Tariffs. How nations built their wealth on trade taxes. By the 18th and 19th centuries, tariffs became the dominant source of government revenue worldwide. Nations relied on trade taxes to fund everything from military campaigns to infrastructure projects. The British Empire, 1700s to 1800s. Britain's infamous Navigation Acts restricted colonial trade to benefit the crown. Tariffs on tea and sugar sparked the American Revolution, as colonists protested taxation without representation. Even after losing the American colonies, Britain continued using tariffs to control trade and finance its empire. The United States before income tax, 1790s–1913, tariffs were the primary revenue source for the U.S. government before income tax was introduced in 1913. The Tariff of 1816 was America's first protective tariff, designed to shield domestic manufacturers from foreign competition. Abraham Lincoln's administration used tariffs to fund the Civil War. Imperial China and the Opium Wars, 1800s. The Qing dynasty imposed strict tariffs on British goods, leading to economic tensions. Britain's military intervention, the Opium Wars, forced China to lower its tariffs and open its markets, demonstrating how tariffs could be both an economic and political weapon. During this era, governments treated tariffs as the primary method of taxation. Income tax, if it existed at all, was seen as a temporary wartime measure rather than a long-term fiscal policy. Why did tariffs decline as a primary revenue source? If tariffs worked so well for centuries, why did nations move away from them? The answer lies in three major shifts. 1. The rise of global trade agreements. As international trade became more interconnected, high tariffs led to trade wars and economic stagnation. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw countries negotiating lower tariffs to encourage global commerce. 2. The expansion of government services. Governments started providing public education, healthcare, and welfare programs, services that required a more stable and predictable revenue stream than trade taxes. 3. World wars and the birth of income tax. Major conflicts, especially World War I and World War II, forced governments to seek new funding methods. Income tax was seen as a more reliable and scalable alternative to tariffs, leading to its widespread adoption. By the mid-20th century, tariffs had taken a backseat to income taxes as the primary source of government revenue. However, they remain an important economic tool, especially in trade policy and protectionism. Conclusion. Could tariffs make a comeback? History shows us that for most of human civilization, governments funded themselves primarily through trade, not personal income taxes. The shift away from tariffs was driven by changing economic and political landscapes, but does that mean we could never return to a tariff-based system? Could modern governments replace income tax with a strategic tariff system? Would consumers accept slightly higher prices in exchange for keeping their full paycheck? How would international trade relations be affected? In the next chapter, we'll explore how a tariff-based tax system could function in today's global economy, and whether it's a realistic alternative to income tax. Key takeaways. Checkmark tariffs were the primary revenue source for governments for thousands of years. Checkmark trade taxes shaped economies, industries, and even military conflicts. Checkmark the decline of tariffs was due to global trade agreements, expanding government services, and world wars. Checkmark a tariff-based tax model still has potential, but it would need to be carefully structured. Chapter 3. How the United States originally funded itself. Why were tariffs the main source of U.S. government revenue before the 20th century? Opening question. Could the U.S. have survived without an income tax? Imagine if, from its founding until today, the United States had never implemented an income tax. How would the country have evolved? Could tariffs alone have sustained a growing nation? For much of its early history, the U.S. did just that, running its government almost entirely on revenue from tariffs. From the late 18th century through the early 20th century, customs duties on imported goods were the backbone of federal financing. This system not only shaped America's economy but also played a crucial role in its industrial growth, trade policies, and even international conflicts. But why did the U.S. choose tariffs over other forms of taxation? And more importantly, why did it abandon them as its primary revenue source? The early years. A young nation's need for revenue. When the United States declared independence in 1776, one of its first challenges was financial survival. The Revolutionary War had left the country deeply in debt, and the government needed a way to fund itself. However, the new nation was founded on principles of economic freedom and resistance to oppressive taxation, a reaction to British policies like the Stamp Act and Tea Act that had fueled colonial rebellion. The Founding Fathers had no interest in implementing a system resembling Britain's income tax model. Instead, they sought a revenue stream that would 1. Generate income without directly burdening citizens. 2. Be easy to collect and enforce. 3. Encourage domestic production and economic self-sufficiency. The solution? Tariffs. In 1789, the very first major law passed by the U.S. Congress was the Tariff Act of 1789, a set of duties imposed on imported goods. The purpose was twofold. 1. Raise revenue for the federal government. 2. Protect American industries by discouraging dependence on foreign goods. With no IRS, no payroll deductions, and no tax brackets, the new country thrived under this system for more than a century. Tariffs. The lifeblood of early U.S. government revenue from 1790 until the early 1900s, tariffs accounted for 80 to 95% of all federal revenue in the United States. The government functioned without an income tax because it didn't yet provide the extensive public services we associate with modern taxation. There was no Social Security, Medicare, or large-scale infrastructure spending. Key benefits of a tariff-based revenue system included simplicity. Customs officials collected duties at ports. No need for complex tax filings. Economic protectionism. High tariffs protected American manufacturers from foreign competition. Political popularity. Most citizens weren't directly taxed, so resistance was minimal. Revenue breakdown. 1790 to 1913. Customs duties. Tariffs. 80 to 95% excise taxes, e.g., whiskey tax. 5 to 15% other revenue sources, land sales, postal services, etc. Minimal. With tariffs providing the bulk of funding, the U.S. government had little need to tax income, until major economic and political changes forced a shift. The role of tariffs in U.S. economic development. Tariffs weren't just a revenue source, they were a powerful economic policy tool. By strategically adjusting import duties, the government could shape the nation's industrial growth. The American system of tariffs. One of the strongest advocates for tariffs was Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury. In his 1791 report on manufactures, he argued that tariffs should raise revenue to fund the government, protect nascent American industries from European competition, encourage economic independence from Britain. This philosophy became known as the American system, championed by politicians like Henry Clay in the early 1800s. The goal was to use high tariffs to build a strong domestic manufacturing base, reduce reliance on British imports, use tariff revenue to fund infrastructure projects, roads, canals, and railways. By the mid-19th century, this approach had made the U.S. one of the fastest-growing industrial powers in the world. Tariffs and the Civil War. The shift toward higher protectionism. Tariffs also played a critical role in the Civil War, 1861 to 1865. The war effort required vast amounts of money, and the federal government needed new revenue sources. While income tax was briefly introduced during the war, it was tariffs that remained the dominant revenue stream. The Morrill Tariff, 1861, dramatically increased import duties, ensuring that northern manufacturers benefited while generating funds for the war. The Confederacy, by contrast, lacked a strong tariff policy and struggled to fund its war effort. By the end of the war, the U.S. had one of the highest tariff rates in the world, up to 50% on certain goods. Even after the war, tariffs remained the federal government's primary funding mechanism for another 50 years. Why did tariffs decline as the U.S. primary revenue source? If tariffs worked so well for so long, why did the U.S. move away from them? The transition away from a tariff-based system happened gradually due to a combination of economic, social, and political pressures. 1. The growth of public services and government spending. By the late 19th century, the role of government was expanding. The country was growing rapidly, and with it came new demands. Public infrastructure projects. Social programs. A standing military. Relying solely on tariffs became less practical, as revenue fluctuated with trade volume. 2. The rise of income inequality and the progressive movement. By the early 1900s, industrialists were amassing massive fortunes while the working class struggled. Progressive politicians pushed for a more equitable tax system, arguing that the rich should pay their fair share directly rather than burdening consumers through tariffs. 3. The shift toward free trade. High tariffs made international trade more expensive, leading to tensions with foreign nations. As the U.S. became a major economic power, it sought to engage in global commerce, making tariff reduction necessary. 4. The introduction of the federal income tax, 1913. The final blow to tariffs as the main revenue source came with the 16th Amendment, ratified in 1913, which allowed the federal government to collect income taxes. The Revenue Act of 1913 dramatically reduced tariffs and replaced them with a progressive income tax system. Within a few decades, income tax surpassed tariffs as the primary funding source of the U.S. government. Conclusion. Could the U.S. rely on tariffs again? For over 120 years, tariffs funded nearly the entire U.S. government, proving that a country can survive without an income tax, under the right conditions. However, in today's globalized economy, such a shift would be far more complex. If the U.S. relied solely on tariffs today, prices for imported goods would rise significantly. Trade relations with other countries could become strained. Some industries would benefit, while others would suffer. Yet, could a hybrid model, where tariffs replace a portion of income tax, be feasible? Would Americans prefer paying slightly higher prices at the store in exchange for keeping 100% of their paycheck? These are the questions we'll explore in the next chapter: how a tariff-based system would work in today's economy. Key takeaways. Tariffs were the primary funding source of the U.S. government for over a century. The American system used tariffs to grow domestic industries. The Civil War and growing government programs led to the introduction of income tax. The 16th Amendment, 1913, permanently shifted the U.S. toward income tax. A return to a tariff-based system would require massive economic restructuring.